A newly elected government in Greece is demanding relief from the tough austerity measures that have been imposed in the last few years. Has Greece done enough to earn credit in that situation? This is Steve Wiseman at the Peterson Institute, where there are differing views, as there are even in Europe, on this situation. I welcome first Paolo Mauro to tell us what has Greece actually done in terms of reducing its fiscal deficit.
Look, Steve, I think that Greece has done an enormous adjustment on the fiscal. If you look at the headline numbers, Greece started out from a terrible situation, in fact, a scandalous deficit in 2009 of 15% of GDP. And the road has been very difficult, particularly for the Greek people. But right now, if you look at the headline numbers on the fiscal deficit, we are at about 2.53% of GDP. If you look at the primary balance, which a lot of analysts look at, that is a surplus of 1.52% of GDP.
Excuse me for interrupting, but define primary balance.
So the fiscal primary balance is the fiscal balance subtracting interest payments. Of course, a lot of debt implies that Greece has to pay a lot on its interest bill. So I would say that now the priority is to reduce uncertainty and is to move toward growth because that's what's really made the situation very difficult, the lack of economic growth.
Now, it has reduced its fiscal deficit, Anders Aslund, as a percentage of GDP, but in your view, what it's done was too little and too late?
Indeed, too little and too late. Therefore, the cost has been maximal and the benefit has been minimal. So what should have been done? When in 2009, Greece had a budget deficit of almost 16% of GDP. In 2010, according to the IMF, Greece made a fiscal adjustment of only 2% of GDP, while Latvia, that was in a similar situation, did a fiscal adjustment of 9% of GDP. When you are in trouble, it's important to get ahead of a curve. So you need to front load fiscal adjustment. That's exactly what Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania did when they were in serious crisis in 2009, and that's what Greece has not done. And if you're not doing what you have to do early on, the cost becomes higher. Greece has now seen 6 years of declining GDP, a total of 24%. This is evidence of a very poor economic policy. So what you can say about Greece, half measures produce very poor results in a fiscal crisis.
So we're in a situation now, though, where a new government is demanding relief. What should the Europeans say to Athens?
Of course, now it's a difficult situation because you have a government that is totally economically mad, wants to increase public expenditure when they don't have financing. Greece's fundamental problem is too large public expenditures and too little markets and too high taxes. This government seems to be going in the direction of aggravating all the problems. Then we have a debt issue, which is a separate thing.
Paolo, it's never easy to predict the future. Greece has done a lot. What should Europe do to achieve both further structural reforms, deficit control, but also growth?
Well, let me come back for a moment on where we're coming from, because I disagree with a lot of things that my colleague Anders says. First of all, the situation in Greece and Latvia and the Baltics was completely different. In the case of the Baltics, there was a lot more consensus given the proximity to Russia to undertake whatever was necessary to be more integrated with Europe, with the Eurozone, and even more important on the economic side, the openness of the economy of the Baltics made it much easier to have a quick rebound, whereas Greece, not having a lot of exports as a share of GDP, had a much harder time in recovering. I think a lot of things were accomplished during these times. When you're referring to the fiscal situation in Greece, I feel we're looking at ancient history. A lot of pension reforms have been done, and the expenditure as a share of GDP right now in Greece is the same as Germany, and in fact it's lower than in France. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. Should things have been done earlier? Yes, they should have collected more revenues earlier on. They should have been much cleaner in their approach to cutting expenditures, focusing on exactly what had to go. So obviously, reducing uncertainty, cutting expenditures sooner would have helped. But we are where we are. I do want to emphasize that we often, as macroeconomists, talk about the deficit in terms of GDP, but let's look at it from the perspective of the man in the street in Greece. If you look at it from that perspective, and you look at real government expenditure per person, it has collapsed by 30% since the beginning of the crisis. Why? Because output collapsed and revenues were, as a consequence, much lower. They had to contain the deficit and actually reduce it. So the result is that for the average citizen, the provision of public services has collapsed. And I think it's important that Europe, in looking at this situation, is mindful of the human cost for the typical Greek citizen. Where this is going to go, of course, we can debate, and I'm sure we'll debate over the next few weeks, but I think it's important to keep that in mind.
We won't be able to resolve it today, but Anders, do you want to make a comment about Paolo's description?
Of course. Public expenditure in Greece has persistently been over 50%, and they peaked at 59% of GDP in 2013, according to Eurostat, which is the best statistics we have, which is better than the IMF statistics. And the Baltic countries have about 35% of GDP in public expenditure. It's a world of difference. It's more than 20% of GDP in difference. Of course, the Greeks have been suffering, but they've been suffering because of the government's bad policy, which was half measures. If a substantial early front-loaded fiscal consolidation had been undertaken, then the Greeks would not have been suffering so much. So it's not an argument that because we have done half measures, we have to continue doing half measures, which is very much what that argument amounts to. Or if we take the Syriza argument, is because we have done half measures, we need to pursue a destructive economic policy. It was by no means obvious that the Baltic countries would increase their exports. It's happened because of substantial structural reforms. Greece has just about the worst business environment and the greatest corruption in Europe, while the Baltic countries have very good business environments because they have pursued the structural reforms. And if you do an early fiscal adjustment, it's so much easier to do the structural reforms, and then you get the supply effects in exports, which, as you rightly state, Greece has not got. But it was not because it was impossible. The reason is that it's impossible to invest in Greece. It's impossible to grow companies because there are all kinds of regulatory glass ceilings, it's heavy taxation and high corruption. Then you don't get growth. Growth is not a matter of macroeconomic stimulus. It's a matter of letting the market and the business free.
Just to close, do you agree that growth, that the key to growth is more in terms of the structural reforms than in changing fiscal policy?
Well, I think everybody agrees that growth is the key priority. How we get more growth, I would say that certainly euro area monetary policy is something that plays a huge role. I think that a lot will have to come from making sure that we don't impose an excessive burden in terms of requiring excessive interest payments. So considering an appropriate amount of debt relief, I think, is the right thing to do. I would certainly make the case to make that contingent on development in economic growth. I think that that said, these things are things that take time, and so structural reforms obviously is always a good thing to do, but we have to be mindful that it takes time for the effects to come through.
Well, I want to invite viewers and readers and listeners to pay attention to the Peterson Institute website, where we will be rolling out a lot of different views about the outlook in Greece. But thank you both very much for talking today.